I don't know why I went out there alone. I had plenty of chances to invite someone along, but I didn't. I think I wanted the quiet, the solitude. It had been a stressful year, and I needed to get away from people. No phone calls, no emails, just me and the woods. It was early October, cool but not freezing yet. The trees had started turning. The air smelled like damp earth, and the campground was almost empty, just how I wanted it. I chose a spot a few miles outside of a small town, somewhere in Oregon. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I had found on a hiking trip months before. It was tucked away from the trails, far enough that I'd have real isolation. I parked my truck at a dirt pull-off and hiked in with my gear, following the tree markers I had left last time. The walk took about 40 minutes, and by the time I reached the clearing, I was already feeling that deep silence I had been craving. No traffic noise, no voices, just wind through the trees and the occasional rustling from small animals. I set up camp near the treeline, close to a large rock outcropping that would block some of the wind. I had brought a good tent, a thick sleeping bag, and enough food and water for 4 days. I planned to hike, maybe fish if I found a good stream. The first evening was exactly what I wanted. I cooked some canned stew over my little stove, drank coffee, and sat by the fire until it burned down to glowing embers. The darkness in the forest was total, the kind of dark that swallows you whole if you don't have a fire or flashlight. The first strange thing happened just after I crawled into my sleeping bag. I was lying there, listening to the wind, when I heard something outside the tent. Not an animal. It was a slow, deliberate sound. A step, then another. I froze, holding my breath. My first thought was that someone had followed me out here, but that didn't make sense. I had seen no one on the trails. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I lay still for what felt like forever, my heart pounding. Then nothing. No retreating steps, no movement at all. Just the wind. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe a falling branch or an animal stepping on a dry leaf. Still, I gripped my knife under my sleeping bag and barely slept. The next day, I woke up feeling stupid for letting my nerves get to me. I spent the morning exploring, marking a path toward a small creek I had seen on my last trip. It was a peaceful day. I followed deer trails, found some old animal bones near the water, and carved a few markers into trees to make sure I wouldn't get lost. When I got back to camp in the afternoon, something was off. Took me a moment to realize what it was. My gear had been moved, not scattered, not rifled through, just shifted. My sleeping bag was unzipped, the corner of my tarp was pulled up, and my pack, which I had left propped against a log, was lying flat. I stood there, trying to work out a logical explanation. Maybe a raccoon or a curious bear. But there were no bite marks, no scratches, and nothing was taken. I checked the ground for footprints but found nothing clear. I spent the rest of the day feeling uneasy, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I hadn't zipped the bag fully. Maybe the wind had knocked my pack over. That night, I built my fire bigger. I kept my knife closer. I barely slept. At some point, deep in the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, careful, circling the tent. I didn't move. I just listened, every muscle locked. The steps stopped directly behind where I was lying. Then came a sound that made my blood go cold, breathing. Not an animal, not the wind. A human breath, slow and steady. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. I just lay there, staring at the dark fabric of the tent, waiting. Then, just like the night before, silence.
No retreating footsteps.
No sound at all. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but when the first light crept through the trees, I was already packing. I wasn't staying another night. I kept my knife in my hand as I broke camp. Everything felt wrong. The silence was deeper, the trees seemed taller, and the air was thick with something I couldn't name. I was almost done packing when I noticed something in the dirt near my tent. Footprints.
Bare footprints.
Not mine. Not from boots or shoes. Just the clear outline of bare feet pressed into the damp ground. They led away from my tent, disappearing into the trees. I grabbed my pack and started walking. Fast. The hike back felt twice as long. Every sound made my heart hammer. I didn't stop until I saw my truck. I threw my gear in, locked the doors, and sat there, breathing hard. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't know how long they watched me. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I just know I won't be going back. I never used to think much about safety when I went camping alone. I had been doing it for years, always following the same routine. Pack up my gear, drive out to a quiet spot, and spend a few days enjoying the silence. It was a way to clear my head, to get away from the noise of daily life. But after what happened that summer, I don't think I'll ever be able to sleep outside again. It was July, and I had taken a week off work to camp in the mountains. I picked a spot I had been to before, a remote area far from any designated campgrounds. The kind of place where no one would bother me. It took me hours to hike in with my gear, but that was part of the appeal. Being completely alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of nature. I set up my tent in a small clearing beside a creek. The water was cold, clear, perfect for drinking. I built a fire, cooked some food, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. The first night passed without incident. The air was warm, the stars bright. I slept deeply, lulled by the sounds of the forest. The second day, I spent my time hiking and fishing. The quiet was exactly what I needed. By the time I returned to my camp in the late afternoon, my legs were sore, and I was ready to relax by the fire. But when I stepped into the clearing, something felt off. My pack, which I had left inside my tent, was unzipped. I was sure I had closed it before I left. My food bag was open too, but nothing was missing. I told myself I must have left it that way, though deep down, I knew I hadn't. There were no signs of animals rummaging through my things. No tracks, no torn fabric. It was unsettling, but I tried to shake it off. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard something outside. Not the usual sounds of the forest, this was different. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not an animal, person. I held my breath, heart hammering, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could see the faint outline of someone standing there. I waited, barely breathing, hoping whoever it was would leave. Minutes passed. Then the figure moved, stepping away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed in my tent, gripping my knife, listening to every sound. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I had scared off a lost hiker. Maybe I had dreamed it. By morning, I had convinced myself I was being paranoid. But when I stepped outside, my firewood was gone. Not scattered, gone. Someone had taken it. That was it. I decided to leave. I packed up my things, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. The trail back to my truck was long, and I wanted to reach it before dark. But as I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. The forest was too quiet. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Then I saw him, a man, standing just off the trail, half hidden behind a tree. He wasn't moving, just watching. I gripped my knife tighter and picked up my pace, my heart pounding. I didn't run. I didn't want to make myself look like prey, but I moved fast, barely stopping for water. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, listening for footsteps behind me. I had about a mile to go when I heard something that made my stomach drop. A second set of footsteps. Closer. I spun around. He was there, standing on the trail, maybe 50 feet away. This time he moved, slowly, deliberately, stepping toward me. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. Branches tore at my skin. My backpack felt too heavy, slowing me down. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the undergrowth. Then I tripped. My foot caught on something, and I went down hard, my hands slamming into the dirt. I barely had time to roll over before he was on me. He lunged, and I kicked out, catching him in the knee. He stumbled, giving me just enough time to scramble to my feet. I grabbed a rock and swung it as hard as I could, connected with his face, and he dropped. I didn't wait to see if he got back up. I ran, faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and threw myself inside, locking the doors. When I looked back at the trail, he was there, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I didn't wait. I started the engine and tore out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. I called the police when I had service. They sent officers to check the area, but they didn't find him. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I know what I saw. I haven't been camping since, and I never will again. It was late December, just after Christmas, when I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep in the backcountry. I had done winter camping before, but this time, I wanted to push myself a little further. I planned a 3-day trip in a remote forest, about 20 miles from the nearest road. No cell service, no people, just the woods and the snow. The drive took me nearly 5 hours from home, mostly on small roads covered in ice. The last stretch was a narrow dirt path that hadn't been maintained since the first snowfall. I had my truck, a sturdy old thing that could handle rough terrain, but even then, it was slow going. The trees on either side were tall and thick, their bare branches weighed down by snow. It was already late afternoon when I reached the spot where I planned to leave my truck. I packed light, just the essentials. My tent, a good sleeping bag rated for extreme cold, plenty of food, a stove, an axe, and a rifle for protection. I also carried a GPS device, but I preferred using a map and compass. I had learned that batteries could die fast in the cold, and I didn't want to rely on technology out here. I strapped on my snowshoes, slung my pack over my shoulders, and set off into the woods. The plan was to hike about 6 miles in before setting up camp near a small frozen lake I had marked on my map. The first few miles were peaceful. The only sounds were the crunch of snow under my boots and the occasional creak of tree branches in the wind. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that stung your nose when you breathed in. There was no sign of anyone else out here, no footprints, no trails. Just endless white and dark tree trunks stretching in every direction. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was setting. I found a spot with a bit of natural cover, near a fallen tree, and started setting up camp. The tent went up quickly, and I gathered wood for a small fire. I made sure to clear the snow down to the frozen ground before lighting it. Dinner was simple, dehydrated food heated up on my stove. I ate quickly, the heat from the fire barely enough to keep me warm. The temperature had dropped fast, probably below 0 by now. After eating, I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful. Then I heard something, a faint noise deep in the woods, a snapping branch. I looked up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing, probably just an animal. I had seen deer tracks earlier, maybe it was one of them. Still, the sound had come from the direction I had hiked in from, which meant whatever it was, it had come after me. I grabbed my rifle and kept it close, but I didn't want to overthink it. I had been in the woods enough times to know that nighttime can play tricks on your mind. I eventually crawled into my sleeping bag, keeping my rifle next to me inside the tent. I left the fire burning low outside, just enough to keep some light around camp. The night was still. The only sound was the occasional crack of ice shifting on the lake. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up suddenly to another sound. This one was different, closer. It wasn't just a branch breaking. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching in the snow, circling my camp. I stayed still, heart pounding. My breath was fogging up inside the tent. I reached for my rifle without making a sound, gripping it tight. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long pause, they started again, moving toward my tent. I held my breath. Then silence. I didn't move. I just listened. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Finally, I gathered the courage to unzip my sleeping bag as slowly as I could. I reached out and unzipped the tent door just enough to peek outside. The fire was still burning low, casting flickering shadows. Nothing. The snow around my tent looked undisturbed. No tracks, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I sat there for a long time, rifle in hand, staring into the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I didn't sleep well. Every small noise had me gripping my gun, waiting, but nothing else happened that night. By morning, the fear had faded slightly, replaced by logic. Maybe I had imagined it. The wind, the shifting ice, my own mind playing tricks on me. I convinced myself it was nothing. I made coffee, packed up my gear, and decided to move deeper into the woods. If someone had been near my camp, I didn't want to stick around. The second day was colder. The wind had picked up, cutting through my layers, and I had to keep moving to stay warm. The trees seemed denser here, the silence heavier. I didn't see any animal tracks, which was strange. No deer, no rabbits, not even birds. Just untouched snow. By late afternoon, I found a new campsite. A small clearing surrounded by thick pines. Felt more sheltered, safer. I set up my tent again, built another fire, and ate my dinner while the sky turned dark. That night, the footsteps came back. I was awake when I heard them. This time, there was no doubt. Something or someone was out there, circling, stopping, listening. I gripped my rifle so hard my fingers ached. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I wanted to call out, to say something, but I held back. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. The footsteps stopped again, right outside my tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. Then, slowly, the steps moved away. I didn't move until the sun started to rise. When I finally got out of my tent, I saw them. Footprints, not boots. Bare human footprints in the snow. They led from the woods, circled my tent multiple times, and then vanished back into the trees. The temperature had been far below freezing all night. No one could be walking barefoot out here, not unless they weren't human. But I knew better. There was no such thing as ghosts or monsters. This was real. Someone had followed me out here. Someone had been watching me. I packed up in record time, not even stopping to eat. My hands were shaking as I strapped on my snowshoes. I started back toward my truck, moving fast, ignoring the burning in my legs. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. The whole way I felt watched. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I expected to see someone standing there, just beyond the trees. I never did. When I reached my truck, I practically threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and tore down the icy road. I didn't breathe easy until I hit pavement. I still don't know who or what was out there. I don't know how they survived in that cold, or why they followed me. But I know one thing. I'll never go winter camping alone again. I never liked camping alone, but sometimes you have to push yourself past the things that make you uneasy. That's what I told myself when I set off for Dartmoor in late September. It had been a rough few months. Long hours at work, personal stress building up, and I needed a break from everything. No phones, no people, just me and the open moorland. I had camped before, but never for more than a night or two. I was used to marked trails and designated campsites, but this time I wanted to be out there. Really out there, away from everyone. Dartmoor was perfect for that. It was vast, desolate, and unpredictable. People got lost there all the time. I parked my car near a small village on the edge of the moors, packed my rucksack with everything I thought I'd need, and set off. The plan was to hike about 10 miles into the moors, find a good spot, set up camp, and spend a couple of nights away from the world. The sky was a dull gray, the air damp but not too cold. The ground was uneven, boggy in places, and the wind cut across the landscape like it had nothing better to do. By mid-afternoon, I was deep into the moors. The rolling hills stretched endlessly, covered in rough grass and scattered boulders. There were no roads, no buildings, just emptiness. I found a relatively dry patch of land near a small stream and set up my tent. It wasn't the flattest ground, but it would do. As the sun set, the wind picked up, howling through the moor. I cooked a basic meal on my small camping stove, ate in silence, and tried to enjoy the isolation. But as the darkness settled in, something felt off. Not in a supernatural way, nothing like that, but in a way that made me uneasy. The moors had a weight to them, an unsettling stillness that didn't feel right. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up. The wind rattled the fabric, and every so often, I'd hear something shifting outside. Probably just the wind moving the grass, maybe a fox or some other animal. Still, I had trouble sleeping. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. No idea why. I lay there, breathing heavily, listening. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence. Then I heard it, footsteps. Not an animal, not the wind. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching on the dry grass outside my tent. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. Someone was out there. I reached for my torch, turned it on, and shone it around the inside of the tent. The sound stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything over the blood rushing in my ears. Nothing. I waited, lying completely still, listening for any movement. The wind picked up again, masking any faint noises. I told myself it was probably my imagination. The mind plays tricks in the dark. That's what I wanted to believe. Anyway, morning came slowly. The gray sky was heavy with mist, and my nerves hadn't settled. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The grass was damp, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. I looked around. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They circled my tent, stopping just outside the entrance before leading off toward the hills. I wasn't alone last night. I tried to stay calm, but my hands shook as I packed up my gear. I told myself it was probably just some lost hiker who saw my tent and wandered close. Maybe they wanted to check if I was okay. But why wouldn't they call out? Why just stand there in the dark? I debated cutting my trip short. Something felt wrong, but I had spent too much time planning this trip to leave now. I convinced myself to move further into the moors, away from whatever had been near my tent. By midday, I had covered another 6 miles, putting distance between me and the footprints. The terrain grew rougher, the hills steeper. I found a small hollow between 2 rocky outcrops and set up camp again. This time, I cleared the area around my tent, making sure nothing could sneak up on me without leaving a trace. The second night was worse. I fell asleep with my knife close, my torch in my hand. Took a while, but eventually exhaustion won. I woke up to the sound of my tent zipper. Not the wind, not an animal. The slow, deliberate sound of someone trying to open my tent. I bolted upright, grabbed my knife, and ripped the tent open with my torch on. The light cut through the darkness, hitting nothing but empty land. The zipper was undone halfway, but there was no one there. My breathing was ragged, my hands trembling. I shone the light around, my heart hammering against my ribs. No movement, no sound, just the empty moor stretching in every direction. I stayed up the rest of the night, knife in hand, listening. The moment the sky started to lighten, I packed up and left. I didn't care about finishing the trip anymore. I needed to get back to my car. The walk back was long. My legs ached. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. Every so often, I felt watched. The open land offered nowhere to hide, but I still felt something behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. When I finally reached my car, I nearly collapsed from relief. I threw my gear into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. Only then did I look back at the moors. In the distance, on the crest of a hill, a figure stood, far enough away that I couldn't make out the details, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. I started the engine and drove away, not looking back again. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. I was never alone on that trip, and I won't be going back. It was late October, and the air carried a sharp cold that settled deep in my bones. I had been camping alone for years, preferring the quiet over crowded campgrounds. This time, I had picked a remote spot deep in the woods, where an old graveyard sat forgotten. I had seen it once on a hiking trip, the crumbling headstones barely visible through the overgrowth. It was the kind of place no one visited anymore. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, so the idea of camping near a graveyard didn't bother me. It was just another patch of land, nothing more. The soil was the same as anywhere else, and the trees stood the same way they did miles away. I parked my truck on the side of an overgrown path, the dirt road too narrow to drive any further. The sun had already begun dipping behind the hills, throwing long shadows over the trees. I grabbed my gear and started the short hike toward the graveyard. The walk was quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant rustling of branches swaying in the wind. I had a thick jacket on, but the cold still found its way through, nipping at my fingers. By the time I reached the graveyard, the last light of the sun had disappeared, leaving only the dim glow of the moon through the clouds. The graveyard was smaller than I remembered, maybe 30 or 40 graves, most of them nothing more than weathered slabs of rock covered in moss. A few iron markers stood rusted and bent, barely holding their shape. I set up my tent on the outskirts, where the land flattened out. The ground was firmer there, free of roots or loose stones. After securing the stakes and rolling out my sleeping bag, I gathered some dry branches to build a fire. The flames flickered to life, casting a dull orange glow against the tombstones. It wasn't eerie, just quiet. The kind of quiet that made you aware of every sound. Twigs snapping in the distance, the wind pressing through the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl. I ate a quick meal, a simple can of beans heated over the fire. The warmth helped push back the cold creeping into my clothes. Afterward, I sat back against a log, staring into the flames. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed small things. The wind barely touched the trees around the graveyard, even though I could hear it moving through the forest. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the kind of pressure you feel before a storm. I shook off the feeling. It was just my mind playing tricks, nothing more. The night dragged on, and eventually, I crawled into my tent. The fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to keep the darkness from swallowing the campsite completely. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. I woke up to a noise outside my tent. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal moving through the leaves. It was deliberate, slow, careful. My breath stilled, my ears straining to pick up every sound. There it was again, a faint crunch, like a footstep pressing down on dry leaves. Then another, closer. I reached for the knife I kept in my backpack, my fingers closing around the handle. My other hand moved toward the zipper of my tent. I hesitated. Whoever was out there, they weren't moving like an animal. They were moving like someone trying not to be heard. I sat in silence, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The footsteps circled the tent, stopping every few steps. Listening, waiting. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe evenly. Then the footsteps stopped, just inches from the tent. I could feel them there, standing just beyond the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was outside. I didn't move, didn't even blink. And then silence. Seconds passed, then minutes. I stayed there, unmoving, listening. Nothing. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on. I took a deep breath and unzipped the tent in one quick motion, stepping outside with my knife ready. The fire had burned down completely. The darkness swallowed everything beyond a few feet. My breath came in thick clouds, the cold wrapping around me. I turned the flashlight toward the ground, scanning for tracks. The dirt was undisturbed. No footprints. No sign that anything or anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I heard. I turned slowly, my eyes sweeping the graveyard. The tombstones stood in their places, untouched. The trees swayed gently in the distance. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. The air felt different, heavier, and the silence, the complete absence of sound, set my nerves on edge. I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I kept the knife in my hand and sat by the cold fire pit, waiting for the first light of dawn. Came slow, too slow. When the sun finally broke through the trees, I packed my gear without hesitation. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to rest. I needed to leave. As I shouldered my pack and took one last glance at the graveyard, something caught my eye. One of the headstones, one I hadn't noticed before, had fresh dirt in front of it, like something had been buried there recently, or dug up. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and walked back toward my truck, my back tensed the whole way. I didn't stop listening, didn't stop watching, and even when I was miles away, the weight of that silence stayed with me. I was never one to be afraid of camping alone. I had done it plenty of times before, setting up my tent in the quiet of nature, away from the noise of the city. There was something peaceful about being alone with the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the crackle of the fire, the distant hoot of an owl. It made me feel small in a good way, reminded me that the world was vast and that I was just a tiny part of it. This trip was supposed to be no different. I had taken time off work, packed up my gear, and driven out to a remote campsite in France. The spot I chose was deep in the woods, far from any main roads. It was a place I had been to once before, years ago, and I remembered it being quiet and undisturbed, just how I liked it. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal. The evening came fast, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth soak into my skin. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crackling of burning wood and the occasional chirp of a distant insect. It was around midnight when I first noticed something odd. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and I was lying in my sleeping bag inside the tent, listening to the quiet of the forest. Then there was a sound. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of the night, it stood out. Footsteps, not the quick, skittering steps of a small animal. These were slow, deliberate, human. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. Nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had dozed off for a moment and dreamt it. I stayed awake for a long time, my ears tuned to the sounds of the forest. But nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The air was crisp, the sky a dull gray as the sun struggled to push through the clouds. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, stretching my stiff limbs. Then I saw them. Footprints. They were faint but clear enough in the damp soil. They led from the trees to my tent and then away again. I felt my stomach tighten. There was no reason for anyone else to be here. This wasn't a well-known campsite. It wasn't even marked on most maps. I had chosen this spot specifically because it was isolated. I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Maybe a hiker had passed through in the night. Maybe they had gotten lost and wandered near my camp. But the prints were close. Too close. Whoever had been there had come right up to my tent. I tried to shake off the unease. I forced myself to go about my morning routine, boiling water for coffee, eating a quick breakfast. But the feeling didn't leave me. I decided to stay another night. I had driven hours to get here, and I wasn't going to let a few footprints scare me off. The day passed slowly. I went on a short hike, keeping an eye out for any signs of other people. I saw nothing. The woods were as empty as they had been the day before. That night, I built my fire up higher, letting the flames stretch into the dark. I sat beside it longer than usual, my ears alert to every sound. At some point, I forced myself to go to bed. I crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving the tent unzipped just enough to see the glow of the fire. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but I wasn't alone. I could hear breathing. It was faint, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. Slow, steady breaths. I didn't move. I barely allowed myself to breathe. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and my mind was racing. Then the breathing stopped. Silence. I stayed frozen, my fingers gripping the fabric of my sleeping bag. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then, a shadow moved against the firelight. Someone was standing outside my tent. I felt a surge of panic. I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself with. My knife was in my backpack, zipped up and out of reach. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every nerve on edge. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I waited, listening, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When I finally unzipped my tent and stepped outside, the campsite was exactly as I had left it. The fire had died down, the ashes cold. There were no footprints this time, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my sleeping bag into my pack, as I broke down the tent. The whole time I felt watched. I didn't look back as I left. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car, parked miles away. I never went camping alone again. I hadn't planned on setting up camp in the rain. It started as a drizzle sometime in the late afternoon, when I was still hiking through the trees, searching for a good clearing to set up my tent. I checked the weather before heading out, and it wasn't supposed to rain until the following morning. But that was always how it went in places like this. I was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, and the weather didn't follow any schedule out here. The rain didn't bother me at first. I'd been camping plenty of times in bad weather. I had the right gear, my clothes were water resistant, and my tent was sturdy enough to handle it. But as the evening wore on, the rain didn't let up. Instead, it got worse. By the time I found a decent spot, a flat stretch of earth between thick trees, with just enough space to pitch my tent. The rain had picked up. It wasn't a downpour, but it was heavy enough to soak through the first layer of my jacket. I moved fast, setting up the tent as quickly as I could, my fingers cold and stiff. Once the tent was up, I got inside, shaking off what water I could and pulling my pack inside before zipping the entrance shut. The sound of raindrops hitting the fabric was constant, a steady pattering that made the inside of the tent feel smaller, like I was wrapped in a cocoon of sound. I was in no rush to leave the tent again, but I needed to eat. I unpacked a protein bar and chewed it slowly, listening to the wind shifting through the trees outside. My original plan had been to make a fire, cook a proper meal, and maybe even sit outside for a while, enjoying the quiet. That was off the table now. The rain kept falling, and as the hours passed, it got heavier. I tried not to let it bother me. I stretched out inside my tent, lying on my back and listening, waiting for sleep to come. The sound of the rain had a rhythm to it, steady and endless. I don't know when I first heard the other sound. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the rain. A soft, irregular noise, something that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. I sat up slowly, my breath quiet. I listened. For a long time, there was nothing but the rain. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, not close, not right outside my tent, but not far either. Maybe 20 or 30 feet away, moving through the trees. I stayed still. My first thought was that it was another camper, but that didn't make sense. I hadn't passed anyone on the way here, and this wasn't a popular area. There were easier trails, better places to set up camp. I had picked this spot because it was remote. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. Instead, I just held it, my fingers tight around it. I kept listening. The footsteps weren't moving closer. They were slow, uneven, like whoever was walking was careful about where they stepped. The sound would come, then stop for several seconds, then come again. I stayed like that for a long time, listening, waiting for something to change. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. I waited, but they didn't come again. The only sound was the rain. Eventually, I let myself lie back down. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the rain playing tricks on my ears. But I didn't sleep. I lay there for hours, listening to the rain, waiting for the sound to come back. Didn't. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly, my body tense before my mind had even caught up. Something had changed. The rain had stopped. It was silent outside. No wind, no rustling leaves. Just silence. I stayed where I was, listening. Then I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time. I sat up fast, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I reached for my flashlight and my knife at the same time. The footsteps were slow, measured, coming from the direction of the trees. Then they stopped, right outside my tent. I held my breath. I could hear my own pulse, the blood rushing through my ears. I waited for something to happen, for whoever was out there to make a move. Nothing. Minutes passed. My muscles ached from staying so still. I couldn't sit there all night, just waiting. I had to do something. I took a slow, quiet breath. Then I switched on my flashlight. I unzipped the tent just an inch, just enough to see outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness. There was nothing there. No movement. No figure standing outside. Just the wet ground, the trees, the empty woods. I opened the tent further, shining the light in every direction. Nothing, but I knew what I had heard. I stepped outside, my heart still pounding. The air was cold and damp. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Then I saw them. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the tree line to my tent, and then away again. I followed them with my flashlight, my stomach tightening. They didn't go far, just past the trees, maybe 30 feet from my tent. Then they stopped, like whoever had been there had stood still for a long time, watching, and then left the way they came. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing. Then I packed up my gear. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I didn't care how far I had to hike in the dark. I wasn't staying here. I moved fast, stuffing my gear into my pack, yanking the stakes from the ground. I barely even rolled up the tent before shoving it into my bag. My hands were shaking. I kept my flashlight on as I moved, scanning the trees every few seconds. I didn't know if whoever had been there was still watching. I didn't want to find out.
Ival ked fast.
Faster than I should have, considering the terrain. I didn't care. Took me hours to reach my car. The whole time I felt exposed. I kept turning, looking behind me, listening for footsteps. I never heard them again. By the time I reached the road, the sky was starting to lighten. I threw my gear into the back of the car, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was nothing, that I had let my nerves get the better of me. But I knew better. Someone had been out there. Someone had been watching. And if I hadn't woken up when I did, I don't know what would have happened.